I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
Charles expected another estate briefing. Instead, one folder changed the atmosphere around him in seconds. Inside was a private proposal bearing Camilla's approval for the disposal of selected Sandringham estate parcels, complete with valuations, prospective buyers, and a timetable that had advanced far beyond casual discussion. The king, Britain's reigning monarch, did not raise his voice. He simply stopped reading, set the pages down, and asked one question nobody in the room wanted to answer. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had always treated Sandringham as more than property. In this dramatized account, the Sandringham estate, the royal family's privately owned country estate in Norfolk, separate from properties held for the crown, meaning the monarchy in its official role, carried Christmas gatherings, family rituals, and memories of his late parents. To him, selling even a peripheral piece was not routine. It was a decision about inheritance, memory, and what should survive after his reign. That was why the file felt brutal. It showed that Camilla had privately supported selling several non-core portions to raise capital and reduce maintenance costs. Charles turned another page and saw something worse. Preliminary conversations with outside property advisors had already begun. Valuations had been prepared. Possible buyers had been discussed. Then he reached the final page and found Camilla's authorization note. His expression changed. He closed the folder, removed his glasses, and asked quietly, "Who else has seen this?" Everyone in the room understood what sat beneath it. How many people knew before the monarch did? Camilla received the message and understood that the dispute had crossed a line. She had viewed the proposal as practical estate planning, but Charles now saw secrecy where she saw preparation. The queen consort, the title used for the wife of a reigning king, knew numbers would not protect her from that accusation. She also knew the most painful detail had not been discussed. One parcel marked for possible disposal was connected to a part of Sandringham Charles associated with his late parents. Charles looked back at that boundary and said nothing. The estate carried generations of family memory, but now one highlighted section had become a symbol of something darker, a future being planned without him. Camilla had challenged his judgment. In his eyes, she had touched something sacred and allowed strangers into the conversation first. What devastated Charles was not simply that land might be sold. It was that the person closest to him had begun planning for a future he believed they were supposed to decide together. Camilla saw numbers. Charles saw ghosts. That difference had quietly existed for years, but now it had become impossible to ignore. To her, parts of Sandringham represented expense, administration, and property that could be reorganized. To him, every acre carried a memory. As William entered the dispute, he quickly realized this was not a disagreement over land. It was a marriage colliding with history. Charles sat alone with the estate map resting across his hands, staring at the highlighted boundaries he had already examined more times than he wanted to admit. Sandringham was private family property rather than a government-controlled royal residence, meaning decisions about its future reached directly into personal inheritance and family responsibility. That distinction mattered to him. He remembered Christmas gatherings there, long conversations with Queen Elizabeth II, and the quiet routines that had once made the estate feel permanent. Now one marked parcel seemed to threaten all of it. Camilla carried a different fear. She told a trusted aide in a private conversation that maintaining every property exactly as it had existed for generations could eventually leave the family trapped beneath costs nobody wanted to discuss. The queen consort believed she was protecting the future, not destroying the past. Charles could not see it that way. For him, the issue was not maintenance bills. It was the possibility that decisions driven by money could slowly erase places connected to people he had already lost. William felt the tension the moment he was shown the correspondence. The prince understood his father's pain, yet he also knew estates required management, staff, repairs, security, and long-term planning. He could not simply dismiss every financial concern because the land carried memories. That left him caught between two people he cared about, both convinced they were protecting the same family in completely different ways. William kept reading, and one detail changed everything. Camilla had not asked advisors to explore one dramatic sale. According to the documented correspondence, she wanted to know whether smaller portions could be released separately, reducing attention while gradually lowering financial pressure. Then he noticed a familiar advisor's name appearing on an earlier exchange. The date stopped him. This had not begun days ago. It had been developing in stages for months. Camilla knew that detail would deepen Charles's anger. She had treated the process as preparation, but he would see months of concealed planning. William understood the danger immediately. Somewhere before the valuations, before the buyers, before the secret discussions, there had been a moment that pushed her into action. The file explained what Camilla intended to do, but it did not explain why she had started doing it. And that answer led straight back to one winter evening Charles had almost forgotten. The real beginning had come months earlier, during a private Christmas conversation that seemed unimportant at the time. Charles had dismissed it within minutes. Camilla had not. What he regarded as a temporary disagreement became for her proof that difficult decisions would never happen if she waited for him to make them. From that moment, the Sandringham dispute stopped being theoretical. It became a quiet plan. Camilla had already watched the pressure build through maintenance discussions, staffing reviews, and arguments over agricultural income. The estate needed money, people, repairs, and long-term management, while another question grew harder to ignore. How much private property should the next generation be expected to carry? Charles saw that inheritance differently. To him, Sandringham was not simply an estate portfolio. It held family rituals, memories of his parents, and places tied to decades of royal life. She believed emotion was blocking practical choices. He believed practicality was beginning to erase meaning. Camilla raised the issue on Christmas night, when the house had finally grown quiet. She proposed selling an outlying tract along with several cottages that required expensive upkeep. Charles rejected the idea almost immediately. He told her the land was part of what had been handed down to him, and he would not begin breaking it apart simply because maintaining it had become inconvenient. The king ended the exchange with a firm sentence. The subject was closed. Camilla did not follow him when he left. She remained seated, looked down at the estate estimate in front of her, then slowly folded it and placed it inside her personal folder, instead of throwing it away. That small decision became the point of no return. Charles believed he had ended an argument. She believed he had proved that another argument, backed by stronger evidence, would eventually be necessary. Camilla acted within weeks. According to documented correspondence prepared for the later estate review, she quietly asked advisors for comparative valuations and wanted to know which holdings could be separated without touching the main house or disrupting the traditions Charles considered untouchable. She did not begin with the idea of a dramatic sell-off. She began by looking for pieces she thought could disappear without changing the heart of Sandringham. Charles now understood how badly that calculation had changed. One parcel connected to some of his strongest memories had risen sharply in estimated value, transforming what began as modest restructuring into a sale significant enough to attract serious outside interest. Camilla saw opportunity. He saw the moment their Christmas disagreement had quietly become something far more dangerous. Charles could forgive disagreement, but secrecy was different. And when Camilla finally walked into the room to defend what she had done, neither of them could hide behind advisors anymore. Charles did not shout when Camilla entered. That made the moment worse. The file sat between them, closed but unmistakable, while neither immediately took a seat. He had already read every valuation, every recommendation, every quiet exchange with advisors. Camilla knew denial was pointless. Then Charles placed one hand on the folder and said the sentence that turned a financial dispute into a deeply personal confrontation. "You went behind me." Camilla finally sat opposite him, but the silence between them remained hard and cold. No senior courtiers were present, and no palace official could soften what was about to happen. This was no longer an estate management dispute. It was a husband demanding answers from his wife. Charles pushed the marked Sandringham map across the table and asked why strangers had been allowed to discuss family land before he even knew it was being considered. To him, every proposed sale felt like inheritance being dismantled piece by piece. Camilla refused to retreat completely. She told him that every previous attempt to discuss modernization had ended the same way. The moment family memory entered the conversation, Charles stopped listening to financial arguments. She reminded him that maintaining distant cottages, agricultural holdings, and underused parcels carried real costs. The Queen Consort insisted that modernization, changing how property is managed so it remains financially sustainable, did not automatically mean destroying tradition. She believed she had been exploring options he would never seriously examine himself. Charles heard the explanation, but it did not touch the wound that mattered most. He accused her of allowing property advisors to discuss land connected to his parents before her own husband understood the proposal. Money could be debated. Maintenance could be debated. Secrecy was different. For him, the betrayal began the moment Camilla created a conversation outside their marriage that should have happened inside it first. Camilla answered with equal force. She said she had never intended to sell Sandringham House itself, or interfere with the Christmas traditions Charles considered sacred. Her plan focused on peripheral holdings she believed could be released without changing the heart of the estate. But then he reopened the file and pointed to a new entry she had not expected him to notice so quickly. Charles had found evidence that one prospective buyer had already requested a second conversation. That single detail changed the room. Exploration suddenly looked frighteningly close to momentum. Camilla insisted no agreement had been signed, but he no longer cared how advisors described the stage of negotiations. Someone outside the family was already waiting for another discussion. Charles ended the confrontation without reconciliation. Even his anger could not answer the next question, because private ownership still involved estate responsibilities, legal structures, and future succession interests. Emotion had reached its limit. Now the battle became brutally practical. Who actually had the power to stop the sale? Charles had worn a crown long enough to understand one uncomfortable truth. Being king did not mean every private decision was simple. Sandringham belonged to the royal family in a deeply personal way, but ownership, estate governance, contracts, inheritance planning, and long-term management still carried rules. As advisors gathered, Charles found himself confronting something almost as painful as Camilla's secrecy: the possibility that the machinery around the estate had already started moving. William entered the private briefing and immediately sensed the strain. Charles stood at the table, gripping its edge, while an estate lawyer explained how far the preliminary work had progressed. Sandringham was privately held royal property, meaning it was family-owned rather than a residence controlled in the Crown's official capacity. That distinction made the dispute deeply personal, but it did not make the process informal. Any disposal still required valuation, title checks, estate review, contractual preparation, and formal authorization before land could actually change hands. Charles listened without interruption, but humiliation burned beneath the silence. Professionals in the room knew details of a proposal he had discovered only after months of private preparation. They knew which parcels had been examined, which valuations had been requested, and which buyers had shown interest. To him, that knowledge felt almost as invasive as the plan itself. He had inherited responsibility for the estate, yet he had somehow become the last person to understand how far discussions around it had advanced. Camilla refused to pretend that every part of her reasoning had been wrong. She argued that exploring options was not the same as completing a sale. No final contract had been signed, no land had transferred. The Queen Consort insisted that she had pushed the issue because rising maintenance costs, staff obligations, and long-term estate pressures had been avoided for too long. Charles heard the logic, but he still could not separate it from the secrecy that had produced it. William then saw the most difficult part of the file. The proposal contained staged disposal options, allowing individual parcels to be considered separately over time. That meant Charles could freeze immediate negotiations, but he could not erase the financial problem simply by shutting the folder. The numbers would remain. The maintenance demands would remain, and eventually, someone would have to confront them. William understood why his position suddenly mattered. One day, much of that responsibility could fall to him. Any restructuring now could shape what the future sovereign would inherit, maintain, or be forced to reconsider later. He sympathized with his father's sense of betrayal, but he could also see uncomfortable logic in part of Camilla's argument. Charles expected William to stand beside him without hesitation. Instead, the first real fracture came when his son chose his words carefully and admitted that Camilla's numbers could not simply be ignored. William chose his words carefully, but Charles heard only the part that hurt. His son did not support the secret planning, yet he refused to condemn every idea inside it. For a man already wounded by Camilla's actions, that distinction felt almost unbearable. Suddenly, Charles was no longer defending Sandringham against one proposal. He was defending his understanding of inheritance against the generation expected to receive it. William made his position clear before leaving the room. He opposed decisions made without transparency, but he also believed the royal family could not preserve every property forever simply because it carried history. Some holdings demanded staff, repairs, security, and long-term spending that future generations would eventually inherit. The prince understood why his father resisted change, yet he also understood that refusing every difficult choice would only push the burden forward. Charles listened, but the logic felt painfully close to agreement with Camilla. Charles remained beside the Sandringham map after William left. One by one, he removed the markers showing the proposed sale areas and placed them face down on the table. That small gesture carried more emotion than anything he had said. He felt as though memories connected to his parents were being reduced to financial figures by the very people he loved most. To him, the question was no longer simply what could be sold. It was whether the family still understood why some things should never be measured only by cost. Camilla began to understand the damage from another direction. She had believed she was preparing the family for realities everyone else avoided, but now she could see that Charles had started questioning whether she understood him at all. The Queen Consort did not abandon her financial argument, yet she stopped defending the secrecy behind it. In a documented handover to the estate team, she voluntarily surrendered all correspondence with the property advisors, including earlier valuations and private exchanges. Charles responded immediately. He ordered every external discussion involving the proposed parcels frozen until a full family review could take place. No buyer would receive another meeting. No valuation would move toward negotiation. The king had stopped the machinery, at least for now, but he knew freezing a process was far easier than repairing trust. Camilla accepted the decision without protest. She understood that another argument through lawyers, maps, and advisors would only make the wound deeper. Charles understood the same thing. The next conversation could not happen through paperwork or through William. It had to happen without anyone between them. The machinery of the sale had been stopped, but the damage between them had not. And the turning point came only when Charles and Camilla finally faced each other without anyone else in the room. Without advisors, titles, or paperwork between them, the argument sounded completely different. Charles no longer asked what the land was worth. Camilla no longer defended the projections. For the first time since the file surfaced, they spoke about fear instead of property. His fear was that the world he inherited was being dismantled before he was ready. Hers was that preserving everything unchanged would leave William carrying burdens nobody had prepared him to face. Charles entered the conversation without notes, lawyers, estate managers, or anyone waiting outside to interpret what he meant. This was deliberate. He wanted no institutional language between them. Sandringham had become tied to something deeper than ownership for him, because age, duty, and succession had made loss feel closer than it once had. The king admitted that the estate still connected him to his parents, to Christmases that would never return, and to a version of family life that had already begun disappearing. Camilla listened differently this time. She did not argue about maintenance figures or valuations. Instead, she told him she had never wanted to erase those memories. The queen consort then returned to the document that had started everything. She slid the original Christmas estimate across the table and said she should have brought it back to him, openly and directly, rather than building a private case through advisors. That admission changed the tone. For the first time, she was not defending the secrecy. She was accepting what it had cost. Charles answered with an admission of his own. He acknowledged that his refusal to discuss the issue had created the silence in which the hidden plan grew. He had treated the original conversation as closed because the subject hurt him, not because the financial questions had disappeared. But he also made one boundary clear. His resistance did not excuse Camilla, allowing private preparation to replace trust. Camilla accepted that point. She admitted that financial logic had outrun personal loyalty, and that was where the real damage began. Together, they reached a new principle. No Sandringham land carrying strong historical or personal meaning would be sold. Less sensitive peripheral holdings could still be reviewed, but only jointly, openly, and with full family discussion. Charles then brought William back into the future of the estate. He asked his son to take part in a transparent long-term plan, turning a secret proposal into a succession conversation that everyone could see and challenge. William's role would no longer be that of a reluctant observer. He would help shape what survived and what changed. The understanding came too late to remain private. Word that the proposed sales had been frozen was already beginning to leak beyond the family. Charles and Camilla had finally reached an understanding inside the family. But outside Sandringham, the story was already acquiring a far harsher meaning. By morning, a private marital rupture had become a national story. The argument was no longer simply whether a few parcels should be sold. It became a debate about history, privilege, money, inheritance, and whether royal tradition could survive modern financial pressure. Yet one image carried more power than all the commentary. Charles arriving at Sandringham shortly after the leak, walking past the gates without addressing the cameras waiting outside. Charles understood immediately how dangerous the story had become. What had begun as a private dispute with Camilla was now being interpreted as a struggle over royal stewardship, the responsibility of protecting and managing property held for the family across generations. Some voices defended preserving historic estates because they carried continuity, memory, and national symbolism. Others argued that valuable land should not remain untouched simply because it carried emotional meaning. The king felt exposed, as personal grief was turned into public argument. Camilla suffered a different humiliation. Headlines reduced months of financial concerns into one brutal idea. She wanted to sell royal land behind her husband's back. The queen consort knew the reality inside the family had been more complicated. But public debate had no patience for careful explanation. Her concern over costs, maintenance, and William's future responsibility disappeared beneath the sharper story of secrecy and betrayal. Then one fictional front page crystallized everything. The Chronicle carried the headline, "Sandringham sale stopped," above an image of Charles arriving at the estate, transforming a private family crisis into the dominant royal story of the day. Hours later, a broadcaster described the conflict as a battle between inheritance and modernization. The phrase spread quickly because it captured exactly what the family had struggled to say privately. Charles watched the coverage with growing frustration. Camilla knew every headline made reconciliation harder, yet both understood that silence could now create even greater damage. The palace finally issued a brief statement confirming that no proposed sale would proceed and that future estate planning would be handled jointly by the family. That announcement stopped speculation about an immediate disposal, but it could not erase the public sense that something serious had fractured behind closed doors. William arrived at Sandringham later that day. His presence mattered. The prince had disagreed with parts of his father's position, but appearing beside the family signaled that the dispute had not become a permanent break. Charles understood the gesture. Camilla did too. The public had already chosen sides, but the final verdict belonged inside the family. And Charles knew the decision now had to repair far more than an estate plan. Charles returned to the same folder that had devastated him, but this time he opened it without anger. The proposed sale had been frozen. The advisors had been dismissed from further negotiations. The family had spoken. What remained was larger than a question of acres and valuations. Charles now had to decide what lesson would survive after the shock faded, and whether trust with Camilla could be rebuilt without pretending the betrayal had never happened. Charles made the decision with a calmness that had been missing from the first days of the crisis. He formally ended the specific plan to sell the Sandringham portions identified in Camilla's proposal, protecting the areas most closely tied to family memory and history. The king also approved a broader review of less sensitive private holdings, meaning properties owned personally by the royal family rather than managed as official crown residences. The message was clear. Difficult financial questions would still be faced, but never again through secrecy. Charles then signed the revised estate instruction and placed the original proposal beneath it. William stood nearby as his father made the new rule unmistakable. No property carrying deep family significance would ever be disposed of without collective discussion. The prince understood what that meant for his own future. He was no longer inheriting only land and responsibility. He was inheriting a new standard for how those decisions would be made. Camilla faced the hardest part without defending herself. In a private conversation, she apologized directly for excluding Charles and admitted that a practical argument had become a personal betrayal the moment outside advisors were brought into the process before him. The queen consort did not withdraw every concern she had raised about cost or sustainability, but she accepted that financial logic could never replace trust. Charles did not pretend the wound had vanished. He acknowledged that his own refusal to revisit the original Christmas discussion had helped create the silence in which the secret plan grew. Preservation, he admitted, could not mean rejecting every uncomfortable decision. But Camilla also understood that modernization could not mean acting first and explaining later. William became the bridge between those two truths. He helped shape a future framework balancing heritage, cost, succession, and family consent. Sandringham would remain protected where it mattered most, while the wider estate would still be reviewed with honesty rather than fear. Charles's devastation had forced something the family had avoided for too long: open conversation. Camilla did not lose her place beside him, but she lost the freedom to pursue restructuring in private. Their trust had been damaged, confronted, and deliberately rebuilt. The crisis ended with one permanent rule, born from betrayal. Nothing of lasting family meaning would ever again be decided in secret. Heritage could change, Costs could be challenged. The future could be reorganized. But trust had to come first. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.